Hi, this is Stu Turgel, your host for the PHOENIX File, a weekly news magazine and community conversation with the people and programs making a positive impact on the quality of life in our community. On tonight's edition of the PHOENIX File, I'll be talking with Matt Lehrman and John Little, founders of Social Prosperity Partners, which works with small stakeholder groups to high-profile community conversations to design and facilitate meetings that engage diverse people and perspectives, de-escalate tensions, inspire collaborative thinking, and spark meaningful dialogue. They believe that social prosperity is the vitality of a community as measured by its inclusivity, purposefulness, and ability to manifest a generous spirit. The time could not be better for more meaningful civic engagement and public involvement. And that's our topic for tonight's conversation on the PHOENIX File, coming up next right here on Radio Phoenix, where the Valley comes to talk, sing, connect. Good evening. I'm Stu Turgel, your host for the PHOENIX File. This is a weekly news magazine that features the people and programs making a positive difference on the quality of life in the Valley of the Sun. Well, there's no escaping the reality that we live in times of deep societal stress. The 2017 Edelman Trust Barometer, a global study of the general population's trust in business, government, non-government organizations, and media reports, that the index has declined broadly and that the majority of respondents now lack full belief that the overall system is working well for them. And we can see evidence of this all around us, from people's anger, distrust, and frustration with federal, state, and local government, to scenes of outright racism and anti-Semitism and intolerance. That was evident in the recent Charlottesville incident. Robert Putnam's iconic 2000 book, Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, may have foreshadowed the current American condition. And more recently, a report commissioned by Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who's the vice chairman of the Congressional Joint Economic Committee, called What We Do Together, tracks the striking decline in many measures of social capital in the country since 1970. The report concludes that people are spending less time socializing with neighbors, and participation in religion and in civic life has declined. Well, my guests on tonight's edition of the PHOENIX File have decided to take on this challenge personally. They've joined forces to form Social Prosperity Partners to pursue a mission to innovate how people address sensitive and complex community issues in ways that actually strengthen feelings of inclusion and productivity. It's a tall task, to be sure, but one that is critically important. Matt Lehrman worked in the Valley's nonprofit arts and culture sector for more than 20 years, most visibly as the founder and executive director of Alliance for Audience and ShowUp.com, a statewide audience development initiative. His expertise is customer engagement, and he consults with companies, causes, and communities nationally. And John Little's passion for community building is rooted in 35 years of service and leadership in local and regional government. He served the city of Scottsdale for more than 24 years, rising to the office of city manager after heading the departments of human resources, organizational effectiveness, and transportation, as well as being appointed executive director for downtown development. Matt Lehrman and John Little, thanks so much for being here tonight, and welcome to the PHOENIX File.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here, Stu.
So let's start by defining what you mean when you talk about civic engagement. What does it mean, Matt?
Yeah, so civic engagement is the process of being active in your community. It's not just when we talk about civil engagement, we're not just talking about being polite and courteous. We're talking about being part of a community and making decisions as part of a community, which means that we have to be open not just to asserting our own beliefs of the way things should be, but that we have to be really connected to what other people are thinking and understand that part of our responsibility is to understand their perspective and address it in a marketplace, in a community. So I'm looking for civic engagement as people who want to be part of holding up their end of the social fabric.
John, how do you look at it?
Well, I look at it that way too. After 24 years in government and attending public hearings, I think all of us have recognized that meetings have just gotten harder. People get together There are so many cultural anxieties that get in the way of our listening, and it creates a lot of noise. As the noise escalates, so does the conversation, so does the incivility, so does the lack of listening and the disconnects that happen. And it's a really critical issue, and I think that what Matt and I are bringing to the table now is something that potentially can really, really help.
What do you think has caused the change in the way in which people have engaged in this whole process?
Well, I want to start from what this term social prosperity is that John and I work from. Stu, the question is why can't you teach someone who's drowning how to swim? And it's because they have to get back to a place of calm, of safety, a place where they have time and options to think about it rather than operating out of panic. And for whatever reason, and we'll talk about them, but for whatever reason, we seem to be in a time where people are operating out of a fear of, out of fear, and out of a fear that somehow they need to behave outrageously or outlandishly in order to get attention, in order to get their point across. And we need to back off a little bit, but this isn't just a question of getting people to be polite. This is a question of affording people the opportunity to be heard, to be respected, to be included in the work of their community, and feel that they absolutely deserve their place at the table.
Yeah, and I think, Matt, you used the word fear twice in there. And I think fear is the operational word that I think breeds incivility. It's these cultural anxieties. Dr. Glasser, who's a sociology professor at the University of Southern California, called fear the greatest social pathology of our generation. Fear gets in the way of our being able to connect with each other. And most of those fears, according to Dr. Glasser, are unfounded. They're fears about the wrong things. And it just gets in the way of our connecting with each other. And part of what social prosperity is to find common ground. We have a lot of common ground that we don't explore as we're disabled by our anxiety and our fear and our suspicions.
Matt, you talked earlier about this is more than just being polite. Mm-hmm. And yet, for us to engage with one another or engage with groups of people, there needs to be a certain level of civility. John, you used that term before. Mm-hmm. If we can't even begin to talk with one another on the level of some form of civility, how can we effectively engage? And so the question is, what happened in this country to see the level of civility? I mean, we see it with road rage. I mean, there wasn't always road rage. There wasn't always the outrageous reaction and behaviors that we see. This is a psychodrama that we're going through as a nation. What do you attribute to that?
Yeah, so there's a whole lot of things at play, and I'm not a master psychologist that I can do this for everyone. But let's talk about some of them. You know, we've obviously seen in our lifetimes, and even just the last 10 or 15 years, massive changes in demographics, of technology, of how people are connected as communities. And that works both how we are in physical communities and how we are in virtual communities as well. Anonymity in online communities has a lot to do with this as well. Our feelings that when we are in public, that we can behave in ways that are not going to reflect back because people don't know who we are. We can somehow get away with it. I think a lot of this has to do with our societal norms as we see in entertainment. What we allow ourselves to play with on TV and in the movies now becomes manifest in how we behave individually. I'm not holding anyone to blame for this, right? I'm not saying that anyone is bad because they like this movie or because they behave this way, but somehow our society has become coarser as a result. But I want to be really careful. And I keep saying this is not just about being polite. This is about, do we take the time to listen to each other? And so if we were being really specific, think about the town halls or where senators are in town and people are coming there and they feel they have to yell. City council meetings, school board meetings, the hostility that's evident there. And this is not just that people are angry. It's that they don't feel respected, and they have things that they deeply care about, and they need an avenue in which to be heard. And the structure of government meetings needs to evolve as well to give people the kind of engagement that gratifies them and makes them feel respected.
Well, I was going to say approval ratings for government at most levels. Certainly, when we look at on the national scene, the approval ratings in Congress have never been this low. But that wasn't always the case. There were times when we admired elected officials. We held them up in a sort of iconic way as models.
I think that people whose ends are served by providing misinformation designed to instill fear in us is at the core. Your question was, how did all this begin? And I don't know that there's a seminal moment, where the light switch went off, but I can tell you that it's a fear. It's a fear of the loss of our jobs. That's why immigration is such a big issue. It's the fear of losing our religious freedoms, or it's the fear of losing our gun rights, or the fear of environmental degradation, and it's the fear of the future of humankind as we look at the situation in North Korea. Political ends are sometimes served by providing misinformation. And I think over time, as a culture, we've been taught to worry about things, and by worrying about things we don't need to worry about, we take our eye off the ball. The ball is social prosperity. The ball is the thing that we have in common with each other. It's our shared values. It's our aspirations, our hopes and dreams. We all want the same thing for our children. We all want good education, and we lose sight of that when we fear things. And so addressing this issue of fear by sitting down and going deep, slowing things down, allowing us to better understand and honor the complexity of issues is critically important to achieving more civil discussion.
Do you see it playing out differently in different parts of the country? Is this pathology sort of uniform across the country, or do we see differences in different areas?
I don't know that there's any geographical result that I think it's generational, and I think it can be demographic in terms of age and race.
Well, I was wondering
background.
if it's any different in emerging communities, in younger, newer communities. This valley is still considered an emerging community. Many people have relocated here from other places, as opposed to older, established eastern communities where you're multi-generational.
I think that's a really interesting question. Matt and I have recently spoken with a couple of different communities. If you have a young community, one that's vibrant and growing and people see opportunity, there's not time to be fearful of things. They're ready to engage. They want to be part of it. It's an exciting time to live. In more established communities, you find people that are afraid of losing what they have. They're afraid of losing their property values. They're afraid of NIMBYism, of people moving into the neighborhood that they're uncomfortable with. And so it's a really interesting question that perhaps younger communities deal more productively with civil dialogue than established communities.
Let me remind our listeners that one way that they can support Radio Phoenix is by becoming one of our sustaining members. For as little as $35 a year, members receive discounts, savings, and other benefits provided by our membership program partners. And don't forget, the membership fee is tax deductible. For more information or to sign up, you can call 480-829-5746, or you can go online to radiophoenix.org. Just click on the Support tab at the top of the page, and then become a member on the drop-down menu. We thank you for your generous support of community radio. Matt, you were going to jump in on what John was saying, I think.
Well, I think, Stu, you asked a really wonderful question, and I have this mental picture of this the Norman Rockwell painting on freedom of speech, where there's a man standing up at a town hall. It's kind of a quintessential New England thing. where the other citizens around him are looking at him, they're paying attention, but they're not necessarily admiring or adoring what he has to say. They might even be skeptical about it. His opinion may be unpopular, but yet he is the noble picture of someone standing up at a public meeting to voice an opinion. And so your question might be, if I was raised in a community where this was the ideal, then I might go for it. But absent that, and in a community like Phoenix, we need to work harder to get there.
Okay. We're going to take a short break for some messages and then more of my conversation with Matt Lehrman and John Little of Social Prosperity Partners. You're listening to The Phoenix File. I'm Stu Turgel, and this is Radio Phoenix. Welcome back to the Phoenix File. I'm Stu Turgel, and in the studio tonight with me are Matt Lehrman and John Little. And now more of our conversation about civic engagement and public involvement. So let's get practical for a moment and talk about what specific advice you have for people who want to be part of their community's dialogue. I understand you've developed a series of 5 questions, and why don't you share those with us?
Yeah, so John and I came up with a way to help people engage with their communities and be open. The first question was, are you open to discussion? We often sit down with people and we want to know, can we talk about these things? Do our values align? But if people are not willing to have the discussion, then let's hold off right there. But we have the opportunity to choose trust. Number 2, let's ask the question, what makes this important to you? Can we understand what the end objective is that makes this important? Can we connect to that specifically? Number 3, can we talk about what values are at stake? John, you have a really good example of communities that look at a development going into a residential neighborhood where someone is looking at that as a business opportunity, but the neighbors look at it differently.
Yeah, I think, when we look at senior housing, and many of our communities are in Arizona are getting older, we need housing for seniors. And we all may live in facilities like that, but existing neighborhoods, look at those as commercial ventures and sometimes oppose those. It's not good community building.
So is it a question of making money? Is it a question of safety? Number 4, what would the future look like if? Can we change the perspective on some of the issues we're looking at and ask, what if we looked at this 10 years from now? How would this be different? And 5, my favorite one is, who else might contribute to this discussion? Stu, the most important thing to know about human beings is we are creative animals. But if we get ourselves into a tug of war, then our paradigm is locked. It's binary. We only have a choice between A or B. Our creativity is stimulated when we add another party or more parties to the discussion. When we open up and we involve other people in with this, then there is no limit to the creativity that we can bring to problem solving all over the place.
So long as we can get past some of those hurdles that you talked about.
Yeah, and nothing creates incivility quicker than not being inclusive, not being, having everyone at the table that needs to be at the table.
In fact, you asked the question earlier, Stu, what's changed? An important thing that's changed for the good is that it's not, there's women, there's minorities, there's a lot more people at the table, and they need to be at the table. And everyone at the table needs to make an effort to be inclusive and welcoming to more perspectives at the table.
I think many of us understand that intellectually. It just becomes very difficult to, we're sort of hardwired, some of us, unfortunately, hardwired to think differently or to behave differently.
Don't you think that comes out of that sense of fear that John was talking about?
I absolutely do. I think fear is really the operative word there. When it comes to civic engagement, you guys are pretty bullish. How do you split the divide between being optimistic and being naive? And what gives you faith in the system when so many on both sides of the political aisle are feeling exasperated?
I think both Matt and I share unquenchable optimism about this topic, about the future of our communities. You see so many positive things out in the community, young people getting involved. There are some Matt and I have talked about developing curriculum, for example, for young people. They are the future. Perhaps middle school kids learning how to be inclusive, what inclusivity means, how to be civil, how to respect the public institutions, how to function in a democracy. These are things that aren't discussed and talked about a lot these days, but we're very optimistic that young people will get that message.
And Stu, look at the way people have responded in the wake of these terrible hurricanes in Florida and in Texas and now Puerto Rico. People want to help. People will volunteer to help. People are community-minded if you give them the opportunity and the tools to do this. What emboldens me about this is that our communities, we still have responsibilities. We're still building roads. We've got public safety. We've got utilities, parks. We're responsible for generating businesses in our economy. We make those kinds of decisions. No one in all of these debates is going on is asking, should we still have cities? Should we still have a nation? We may have different views for what that is, but at the end of the day, we still want to be the community that we are.
Well, I think and I wrote about this in a commentary a few weeks ago, but I think the silver lining in the cloud that was over Texas and Louisiana at the time, and then ultimately Florida as well, was the fact that, and it came at a great time. It came on the heels of Charlottesville, when we were at our wits' end about what we were seeing, and yet, as you point out, Matt, what we saw during the hurricanes, as soon as the storms moved out, was that everyone was willing to help. It didn't matter who they were saving, who they were carrying on their back, and we saw all those images, and I think that goes a long way too. So the basic goodness of the American people was seen and we'll see it again now as maybe a little more difficult in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, simply because they're so isolated. But I think those were good examples.
But a related question to that, Stu, John asked me as we were driving over is uncivil behavior, is it ever justified?
Yeah, it's throughout our history, not just our history, but throughout world history, sometimes incivility can be strategically applied to get the attention of the establishment that perhaps isn't inclusive, that has barred people from participating, that has closed the doors. And sometimes knocking on the door needs to be done with both the fist and the foot, just to get people's attention.
Civil disobedience has been a part of our culture for as long as we've been an American people. We certainly are seeing signs of that just this past week, of course, with all that's been going on with the NFL. Whether that's fully civil disobedience or not, I don't know, but it certainly has been likened to many examples of civil disobedience in the past. We're hearing about Rosa Parks. We're hearing about Dr. King. We're hearing about a lot of people who stood up and just said, no, it's not going to be this way.
That's right. But when we see these kinds of protests going on, our knee-jerk reaction is to go, I agree with that, or I disagree with that. Wouldn't it be interesting to step back and say, why does that person feel this is the necessary thing to do? If we could just spend more time trying to understand where they're coming from on this, we could accomplish a great deal more.
Yeah, here's a few things I want to understand, and I think they're critically important. One is that young people are not registering to vote in the same percentages that people registered to vote in my generation. They're not volunteering and not participating when they're asked to serve on juries. They're not volunteering for the military. They're not. They're choosing to opt out, and I think this is a very worrisome trend among millennials, and yet there's so much energy and creativity among that group. It's how do we engage them? How do we touch them? How do we, as Matt just said, how do we take the time to understand what are those things that are causing them to not participate at the levels that we really need them?
Yeah, let's look into the future a little bit if we can, and let's talk about the future with a two-part question. First, what do you see as the downside risk or the downside trajectory of not finding ways to cure incivility in our lives? And second, what do you see as the upside potential from innovating new practices of civic engagement?
Well, I'll start with what's at stake and what's at risk. And without sounding too alarmist, I think our very democracy's at risk. What kind of a democracy can exist where people won't participate on a jury of our peers? What kind of democracy exists if people choose to not vote? What kind of democracy exists absent people willing to serve in the armed forces? That's what's at risk, is how do we engage people in productive ways and understand through conversation why you're not participating? What are the barriers to that? So I think our very democracy's at risk unless we can really address in productive ways and learn how to speak with each other, learn how to be better at that.
You know, some of my listeners know that I love the term BHAG, which stands for the Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal, and an idea that was conceptualized in the book Built to Last, Successful Habits of Visionary Companies by Collins and Porras. Collins and Porras talk about BHAG as a long-term goal that changes the very nature of a business. So, Matt and John, what's your BHAG or your ultimate dream?
I love that. I love your question. So if necessity is the mother of invention, then there better be a whole lot of invention going on right now, because the need for creative solutions to community problems at every single level, federal to local, have never been greater. From the climate to how we pay for and sustain infrastructure in our communities and everything in between. We got more people, we got more opportunity, and we got to keep working at it.
No, that says it all. It sounds to me that the climate is not just right for this approach, but given the stresses that we're going through at the national, state, and local level, that this approach has never been more critically important. So I wish you great success in helping to bring about positive cultural and behavioral change in civic engagement and personal involvement. Matt and John, much success with your new venture, and thanks for being here tonight on the PHOENIX File.
Thank you.
Delighted. Thank you.
Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks again to my guests tonight, Matt Lehrman and John Little of Social Prosperity Partners. Please join me next Tuesday night at 6:30 when my guest will be Elizabeth Wright of Make-A-Wish, Arizona. Until next week, thanks for listening to the PHOENIX File. For Radio PHOENIX, this is Stu Turgel.